Driving the Lincoln Highway, Chicago to Rochelle, Illinois, in 1915. By Emily Post. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mud. We have struck it. It looks pretty much as though our motor trip to San Francisco were going to end in Rochelle, Illinois. 36 miles out of Chicago, we met the Lincoln Highway, and from the first found it a disappointment. As the most important, advertised, and lauded road in our country, its first appearance was not engaging. If it were called the Cross-Continent Trail, you would expect little, and be philosophical about less. But the very word highway suggests macadam at the least, and with such titles as Transcontinental and Lincoln put before it, you dream of a wide, straight road, like the Route Nationale of France, or state roads in the East, and you wake rather unhappily to the actuality of a meandering dirt road that becomes mud half a foot deep after a day or two of rain. Still, we went over it easily enough until we passed DeKalb. After that, the only highway attributes left were the painted red, white, and blue signs decorating the telegraph poles along the way. The highway itself disappeared into a wallow of mud. The center of the road was slightly turtle-backed. The sides were of thick black ooze and ungaugably deep, and the car was possessed as though it were alive, to pivot around and slide backward into it. We had no chains with us, and had passed no places where we could get any. Apart from the difficulty of keeping going on the chainless tires, our only danger, except that of being bogged, was in getting over the bridges that had no railings to their approaches. The car chassed up every one, swung over toward the embankment, slewed back on the bridge, went across that steadily, and dove into the mud again. It certainly was dampening to one's ardor for motoring. If the Lincoln Highway was like this, what would the ordinary road be after it branched away at Sterling? A little car on ahead was slithering and sliding around too, although it had 4 chains on it. But it did not sink in very far, and it was getting along much better than we were, so much better, in fact, that at the end of a few miles it slowly wobbled beyond our sight. Finally we turned a bend, and there was a little car on ahead. Not the same one, however. This one evidently had no chains, and was coming toward us, drunkenly staggering from side to side. Gradually the lower half of it was hidden by the incline of an intervening bridge. Then suddenly it disappeared altogether. When we arrived at the bridge ourselves, we saw the car in a deep ditch, almost over on its side. The occupants of it, a man and a small boy, were both out, and nothing apparently was hurt. The small boy was having a heavenly time paddling around in mud way above his knees, and the man called up to us cheerfully, "'Twas my own fault. I hadn't ought to come without chains on. No use for you to stop, thank you. You couldn't help any, and we'd only blocked the road between us. A team will be along before long." Regretfully we left them, and slipped and slid and staggered on for some miles more. "Oh," said Celia in the back, "how are we ever going up that? that was an awful embankment ahead which to look at made me feel as if I had eaten nothing for a week. It was steep, narrow, turtle backed, with black slime, and had a terrifying drop at either side of its treacherous and unguarded edges. The car went snorting up the incline until, nearly at the top point where the drop was steepest, it balked and slid toward the edge. This is the end, I thought, wondering in the same second if any of us would fall clear. For one of those eternity-laden moments we seemed to hang poised on the brink. Then E.M. seemed almost to lift the huge weight of the machine around bodily and compel it, in spite of its helplessness, to crawl up, up, up on the bridge. Glancing back at Celia after we were safely over, she looked about as chalky and weak-kneed as I felt. A short distance further, however, we ran on the brick pavement of a town. The ragged red brick buildings of the street we turned into were not very encouraging, and we feared that again the Blue Book's hotel description might be one of those complimentary ones consisting of its paid advertisement. E.M. urged our trying to get chains and going on to Davenport, but Celia and I had all the motoring in the mud that we cared about. No matter how squalid the town or how poor the accommodations, we meant to cross no more bridges like that last one until the roads dried. Then we made two turns like a letter Z and found ourselves in the sweetest, cleanest, newest little town imaginable. Its streets were all wide and smoothly paved with brick, and its houses, mostly white, were set each in a garden of trim and clipped green. There was a new post office of marble magnificence, and a shopping centre of big windowed, fresh painted, enterprising stores, but no hotel except a dingy ramshackle tavern that we took for granted was the one mentioned in the guidebook. We wondered if one of the neat, sweet little houses might perhaps take us to board instead. In front of a garage was a man with a blue coat and brass buttons and "Fire Chief" on them. We asked him if he knew anyone at whose house we could stay until the road dried. He looked at us and then at the car in a quizzical sort of way. "Oh, yes," he drawled, "you could put up at Mrs. Blake's, I guess." We asked the way to Mrs. Blake's, and then happened to remark that it was curious a town as up to date as this one had no good hotel. He lost his drawl immediately. "No good hotel? Well, I just guess there is a good hotel. The Collier Inn is just across that street and around the corner. It's a fine hotel." We cheered up instantly. But why hadn't he told us that sooner? He thought that, considerin' we had asked for a boarding house, maybe the hotel was too high priced for us, but it was a fine hotel if we didn't mind the cost. I don't know how we had missed it. It was a fair-sized yellow brick building on a corner, a rather typical small town commercial hotel. I went in expecting dingy darkness. The lobby looked like the office in a Maine summer resort. I asked, not that I for a moment expected to get it, for rooms with baths. The proprietor said certainly, and showed me 3 new little rooms, each with a little new bathroom attached. I returned to my companions grinning like a Cheshire cat. It seemed to us as though we had found a veritable Ritz. In Rochelle. 24 hours in a town like this, and we feel as though we knew it and the people intimately. In many ways it suggests a toyland town. Its streets are so straight and evenly laid, its houses so white and shining, its gardens so green, its shops so freshly painted, its displays in the windows so new, and its people so friendly. Strangers in town, they seem to say to themselves as they look at us, but instead of looking at us in a "wait until we know who you are before we take any notice of you," they seem quite ready to smile and begin a conversation. Our most particular friend, as well as our oldest acquaintance, is the fire chief. E.M., of course, has one or two other particular friends in the garage. If he can only find a mechanic or two to talk to, he is perfectly happy. Celia's and my chief diversion has been going to the moving picture theaters, which is evidently the fashionable thing to do here. In the evening we saw 3 real theater parties. One of them was a very important affair. They met in the lobby and went down the aisle 2 by 2. The ladies all had many diamonds, brand new white kid gloves quite tight, picture hats, corsage bouquets, and boxes of candy. Celia and I had neither gloves nor hats on, and when we ran into the theater parties we felt almost like urchins that had been caught wandering into the foyer of the Metropolitan Opera House. Like our hatred of caraway seeds, our love of hatlessness must be a family failing. In Chicago 2 different papers took the trouble to mention E.M.'s carelessness in the matter of head covering. "Scorning to wear a hat even on occasions when it is generally considered to be convenable," said one. The other described him as "such a disciple of fresh air that he was seen driving a big racing machine on Michigan Avenue without a hat." Yet isn't it a popular supposition that the West is freer from conventions than the East? The rain has finally stopped, and this morning the sun is trying hard to shine. To do much good it will have to shine steadily for about 3 days. We walked to the end of the brick paving down one of the streets a little while ago, and looked at the black, wet Lincoln Highway leading to Sterling. On our way back we met our friend the fire chief. "Been to look at the mud?" asked he cheerfully. "It isn't a bit bad now. You ought to see it when it's muddy. Why, it took me 8 hours to go 21 miles. I did have to get a team of horses to pull me out of one bog, but otherwise I got through all right." "Didn't you strain your engine?" I asked him. "Oh yes," he said cheerfully, "I guess I did, but I couldn't help that." "Well, maybe you couldn't," I agreed, then added with confidential finality, "but I tell you what we're going to do. We're going to put ours on a nice dry comfortable freight car tomorrow morning and ship it past the mud district, which is probably the width of the continent." His warmth of manner fell suddenly to 0. I feared we had in some way offended him because we thought his state muddy. "Of course it is a lovely country to grow things in," I added quickly, "but you see we want particularly to get to San Francisco, and the surest way is by freight." But we could not put the broken conversation together again. In fact, our friend the fire chief doesn't smile any more. Our other friends, the garage men, also look at us askance. In fact, in some way, we seem to have lost our popularity. The weight of public opinion. We know now what is the matter. They think we are quitters. They are so filled with a sense of shame for us that we are beginning to feel it ourselves. In spite of our original intention to go only so far as roads were good and accommodations were comfortable, we feel that we are somehow lacking in mettle, that we are sandless, to say the least. To explain that we are not crossing the continent as a feat of endurance is useless. Having started to motor to the west, our stopping this side of the place we set out for is to them incomprehensible. Why, that car ought to go through anything, is all any of them can think of saying to us. Our friend the fire chief stood glowering out in front of the garage all morning. I think he would have gone to great lengths to prevent our machine's incarceration in a freight car. The proprietor of the garage gave us his opinion. Of course we drive pretty light machines around here, and yours is heavy and your wheels are uncommon narrow, but that engine of yours sure ain't no toy. I'd go through if I was you. I wouldn't quit for a little mud, no sir. And only a little mud at that, scornfully echoed the fire chief. And supposing we slide off one of those bridges or turn turtle in a ditch, asked we. The chief scratched his head, but his determination was undaunted. She'd be kind of heavy to fall on you, he grinned. All the same, if that car was mine, I'd go right on plumb across hell itself, I would. To finish what you have begun, to see it through at whatever cost, that seems to be the spirit here. It is probably the spirit of the West, the spirit that has doubled and trebled these towns in a few years. The consideration as to whether it is the wisest and most expedient thing to do has no part in their process of reasoning. That is exactly the point. Theirs not to reason why, theirs not to make reply, theirs but to do and die. Only they do not seem to die. They thrive gloriously. All the same, if this country of ours ever gets into the war, there will be the making of a second Balaclava regiment in a town of Illinois beginning with an R, and a certain fire chief should make a gallant captain. But magnificent as is their indomitability as a quality of character, for us the instance to wreck a valuable car, which we might never afford to replace, for the sake of saying that we were not stopped by any such trifle as mud, seems more foolhardy than courageous. Nevertheless, they have in some way imbued us with their spirit to such a degree that we have countermanded the freight car, and although the mud is not a bit better, have put chains on and are going to start. Enthusiasm was no name for it. The town turned out to see us off. The fire chief drove out his engine in all its brass and scarlet resplendency. The ban of our cowardly leanings toward freight cars was lifted, and they saw us off on our muddy way, rejoicing. We are glad to have seen this little town. Maybe the contagion of its enthusiasm will remain with us permanently. End of Driving the Lincoln Highway, Chicago to Rochelle, Illinois, in 1915, by Emily Post. Read by Sue Anderson.